Good evening again to those of you who've been here for the meal, and welcome to those of you who are joining us now for our lecture, the 2024 DURNBAUGH lecture. I'm delighted that all of you are here this evening. The DURNBAUGH lecture at Elizabethtown College honors the lives and work of Hedda DURNBAUGH and the late Donald DURNBAUGh, towering figures in the fields of Brethren history, theology, hymnody, and bibliography, and who were instrumental in helping shape the Young Center in its early years in the 1980s and early 1990s. Unfortunately, Hedda could not be with us this evening, but she sends her greetings to all of you. She wanted me to pass that on. 80 years ago, as war and hunger and poverty and colonialism marked our world in some ways not so different from our world today, a creative and remarkable grassroots global relief idea began taking shape, driven by desire to offer concrete, practical responses to hunger and starvation engendered by violence, creative in its early attention to sustainability, ahead of its time in many ways by providing aid with relatively few strings attached. That effort was Heifer Project and was driven by Church of the Brethren activist Dan West. But as a grassroots movement, it would not have been possible without the enthusiastic support of many, many Brethren families, especially farm families, including many right here in the lower Susquehanna Valley. This evening, we celebrate 80 years of what is now known as Heifer International, and its mission to end hunger and poverty while caring for the earth. And we'll be hearing this evening from historian William Kostlevy and from Heifer's CEO, Sarita Sondesheim. I think I'll introduce them each separately before they speak. So I'll begin with William Kostlevy. I always call you Bill, but that's fine. All right. Bill Kostlevy holds degrees from Bethany Theological Seminary and the University of Notre Dame in history. He is co-editor of a number of works, including Hoosier Prophet, Selected Writings of Dan West. It was published late in 2021, and again, we have copies for sale here on the table. Kostlevy has served as archivist and as director of the Brethren Historical Library and Archives in Elgin, Illinois. And connection here, he was also visiting fellow at the Young Center in the fall of 1997. So welcome, Bill.
It's a special privilege to be here. If you don't, my wife would be shocked that I can't be heard, but I realize that I may not be heard, and I encourage you, especially at the back, to raise your hands and tell me if I'm speaking too quietly. The Young Center is a special place for me, and I want to encourage all of you to continue to support it. It's one of the most remarkable institutions that serves the academic needs of our communities in the Anabaptist Brethren tradition. It has done remarkable work. As Steve mentioned, the connection with Johns Hopkins University Press is something to be really proud of. And so I want to say, and that's also very important for my career. In 1996, when I came here, I knew little. I was just beginning my academic career, and this gave me a basis for studying throughout a basis for that academic career. Heifer at 80. It has a real ring. Not every humanitarian NGO has such staying power. An organization I've long been interested in is the Salvation Army, founded by William and Catherine Booth. It actually did very little, but many other revivalist groups in the late 19th century. Many groups did exactly the same thing. But the Booths had remarkable ability about drawing attention. And of course, they kick off their annual Red Kettle. They've entered an iconic American phase with their Red Kettle campaigns, kicked off by the Dallas Cowboys at Thanksgiving. I remember a few years ago watching the game, which I usually don't watch, and observing that someone I knew, John Busby, the general of the Salvation Army, was appearing with the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. I'm guessing Evangeline Booth probably would have approved, but her mother, Catherine, co-founder, I'm sure would have been deeply offended. Then there is the Mennonite Central Committee. Now, if you think that's a normal name for a humanitarian organization, probably spent too much time in Pennsylvania. But in fact, it is a respected international humanitarian body. Not everybody lasts. In the early 20th century, the Christian Witness magazine rivaled the Red Cross as the most important American humanitarian agency. It raised literally millions of dollars for relief in Russia and during the Indian famine of the 1890s. But by 1920, it had basically ceased as a humanitarian body. So what is it about Heifer? Well, I have a simple answer. It's the cows. Pretty sad.
We can't hear it. Just really. You need to get it.
Yeah. This is a real challenge. Now, I am prejudiced. I grew up in a dairy farm in Wisconsin. The first word I could spell was Pat, the name of our wonderful brown Swiss cow. She was the first cow I ever milked. And she was older, wiser, and more gentle than the kid doing the milking, believe me. Now, Wisconsin was a righteous land when I grew up, not like it is today. You had to drive to Illinois to buy oleomargarine. That is colored oleomargarine. And as Dave Zweifel of the Capital Times said a few years ago, and 2 years after the fall of the orange barrier, Wisconsin had legalized gambling. You need to keep sin out. Now, I've often, in a neighbor's farm, there was a sign. It said, please treat these cows with respect because they are the foster mothers of the human race. Those are the words of William Dempster Hord. A few of you know who William Dempster Hord was, I'm sure. Founder of that great Wisconsin literary journal, Hord's Dairyman. And they Bible by dairy farmers to this day. In other words, Heifer has ties to the land and ties that tug on our emotion and ties that speak to us in ways that are powerful. Now, there are other actors, and I'm going to talk about these shortly. There's the land, the people, and the economy. The fertile valleys of eastern Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, western Ohio, northern Indiana, Iowa, Kansas. These are heartland. And that's actually part of the Heifer story. My favorite historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, knew that land was more important than people. That continues to irritate historians today. Or there's a wonderful book, now 50 years old, by James T. Lemon, Best Poor Man's Country, about rural eastern Pennsylvania and its inhabitants. Lemon deals with a question: why were they sectarian? The Dunkers, Mennonites, Schwenkfelders, Moravians, better and more successful commercial farmers than their Lutheran neighbors? The answer has something to do with community. As politicians still remind us, war, if it isn't fought on your own land and by your own sons and daughters, can be highly profitable. In North American history, some of the greatest periods of agricultural prosperity have been times of mass human slaughter. During the American Civil War, if you didn't manage to have your fields trampled, your horses stolen, your cattle butchered, you could make lots of money. Periods of great economic growth. Even minor wars can stimulate the economy. The Spanish-American War actually played a factor in ending the Depression of the 1890s and ushered in 20 years of great agricultural prosperity in the United States that terminated with the end of World War I and was followed by 20 years of agricultural depression. There's lots of reason that the Great Depression of the 1930s is tied to the farm depression that preceded it by an entire decade. It was during this time of prosperity that Heifer was born. And the reality is that times were good, especially if you get an agricultural deferment during World War II. War was also a profound factor in the life of Dan West and the origins of Heifer. It's not only World War I, Spanish-American War, World War II. It begins the Civil War, and it begins with his parents. Barbara Landis West and Landon West. Landon West did what many people did during the Civil War from the peace churches, Mennonites, Brethren, and others. He hired a substitute. But as happens in war, according to family tradition, the substitute was killed in the war. The substitute was also Black. It should be pointed out that Theodore Roosevelt's father did this, who was a New York banker, did the same thing. He hired a substitute. Landon West struggled with this reality for his entire life. And in working on this paper, in working on Dan West, I concluded that his father was probably more interesting than he was. He spent lots of money educating young Black Americans. He worked with Samuel Ware, the first Black ordained elder, championed expansion of Black Americans. This was something he did all his life. In the small box of Landon West papers that came to the BHLA, there's a poem, A Bright Day Coming. It's a wonderful short poem. But it's basically, it talks about a day coming when war would cease and human brotherhood prevail across racial lines. It's optimistic, hopeful. It's a lot like Heifer. Dan was drafted into the First World War and faced the agony of deciding how to deal with the war effort. And in the midst of the Church of Brethren's really confused response to the First World War. He actually ended up spending time in the military, was eventually sent home, thankfully, without fighting. His experiences in the Spanish Civil War are the foundation for Heifer. He joined an American Friends Service Committee group serving meeting human needs during the Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was particularly brutal. The fascist forces were practicing for World War II. Mass numbers of civilians were murdered. The Republican forces supported by the Soviet Union were equally notorious for disregarding human life. Hundreds of Roman Catholic priests and nuns were killed by the Republican forces. George Orwell, great author of Animal Farm in 1984, was also served in that war and became so disillusioned with the left that it affected the writing for the rest of his life. Dan West was particularly irritated by the anarchists he encountered in the war. People who had no appreciation for the need for order in government, and that's a constant theme in Dan West's work. He was also frustrated with the moral lack of enthusiastic humanitarian responses of the churches. In a letter to his wife, Lucille, he wrote, "It is 4 centuries since Loyola, and more than 10 since Christianity had a strong foothold here. That is long enough. A church with a chance can be indicted for not doing its daily duty. The failure of the so-called Christians to live the faith they profess is a continual theme in all. The failure of the church to meet these needs is a continual theme in Dan West's writings." Now, for those of us who live between the Hudson River and the Rocky Mountains, are often taken for granted, except when we cause trouble. Heifer really needs to be understood in the context of these rich agricultural regions. This is a real American Bible Belt. Literacy is important for a Bible Belt. Eastern Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, west into Kansas. These are sort of the foundations for the massive humanitarian surge that occurred during this time. Brethren established the Brethren Service Committee. Then, in an effort to confuse every later Brethren historian, they immediately renamed it the Brethren Service Commission with the same initials. In 1941, this is before the U.S. is involved in the war, the BSC was urged to serve the hungry, thirsty, sick, and naked, or in the words of Scripture, the least of these. The Brethren Service, the BSC's focus during the war was largely taken up with managing civilian public service, which people here know all about. But despite the focus on CPS, Brethren did do lots of interesting other things on the international scheme. One of my favorite is the work of John Barwick, who worked with German prisoners of war in England for the YMCA. Barwick from York, Pennsylvania. His greatest success there was he managed to influence a young German POW by the name of Jürgen Moltmann, who would become the most important German Reformed theologian of the post-war years. A place to read all about that, by the way, is In a Cup of Cold Water by Ken Kreider, which you should buy if you don't already own. The situation. It's easy for us who know how the story ended to not appreciate how dire the situation was during the early to mid-1940s. Herbert Hoover estimated that a third of the world's population were hungry, did not have adequate food. As early as 1941, the United States established a couple of humanitarian agencies, especially with British and especially with South American countries who were not directly involved in the war. The most significant was the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. From 1944 to 1947, the United States alone invested $2.7 billion in this effort. That's lots of money when $1 billion was worth more than $1 billion is today. Brethren worked with two of the most famous projects, famous care packages, which were distributed for many years. which was a cooperative American remittances to Europe, and that was changed with cooperative American remittances to everywhere. And Kralog, which was headed by Eldenberg, a Church of the Brethren member, and also did significant relief work, especially in the areas, especially in Germany. Despite its massive scope, generally, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was considered a failure. Basically, only a third of those in need were being helped by 1946. In China, an estimated $132 million went into either warehouses, black market, or in the hands of government bureaucrats. These included food, machinery, fishing boats, and I hope this last group didn't end up in a warehouse, water buffalo. By the end of 1946, the Cold War was already beginning to change the face of the environment. Increasingly, American aid would be tied to things like the Marshall Plan and other things, which were very specifically tied not to helping everyone, but to helping American allies. Still, giving by religious bodies was pretty remarkable. As late as 1959, so-called sectarian bodies, largely Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, were contributing 2/3 of all non-governmental charitable giving. And Heifer is actually part of that story. It's part of this massive humanitarian effort. Now, Heifer is a different kind of a program than many of the programs of the era. 1920s, 1930s were times often talked about these great massive government programs. The collectivization of agriculture in Russia, the Tennessee Valley Authority's massive plans to end poverty in the American South, the building of the, slightly later, but the building of the Aswan Dam in Egypt. Happening at the same time were smaller scale development projects. And there is actually a recent wonderful book which deals with these. It's called Thinking Small, the United States and the Lure of Community Development. Beginning in the late 1940s into the 1950s and 1960s, massive amounts of government, of not only American, but other countries. In India, virtually every village established some kind of community development program. In the Philippines, the United States decided it was easier to fight communism with community development than with bombs, and so significant funding was poured into the Philippines. Unfortunately, these programs often, as Daniel Immerwahr says in his book, Thinking Small, the United States and the Lure of Community Development, often these programs were disappointing. They tended to support elites in villages. They tended not to change the structures of society. They were often caught up in the controversies of the Cold War. Among the key American programs, and some of these will sound familiar to many of you, the USAID, the United States, the International Development and USAID, International Voluntary Service, and programs often did not spend their money wisely. Or, by the way, the International Voluntary Service was virtually a Church of the Brethren front organization in its early days. But as Carl Taylor, a veteran observer of New Deal and later programs and a key Department of Agriculture figure in the 1930s, pointed out, basically the programs had ossified into top-down bureaucracies, becoming mechanized at the local level and becoming chore boys for national administrations. I was disappointed that Immerwahr didn't talk about Heifer because he should have. And for one reason, this is his doctoral dissertation, a version of it from from the University of California, Berkeley, and his advisor was none other than David Hollinger, who I was going to describe as an apostate brethren, but I won't because that might offend people. But who is David Hollinger was one of the really great American historians of our time, by the way. So Heifer. Heifer was one of many small-scale programs. Its actual evolution, as many people here know, was rapid. In 1938, Dan West left Spain with an idea. He stopped in England to share it with Friends Service Committee leaders. They were completely unimpressed. They thought that some of the cows might be providing milk for the children of the fascists and not of the heroes of the struggle. He met a better response when he talked to his friend, local Columbia, Pennsylvania Guernsey farmer, Ben Bouchon. West and Bouchon had a long relationship. Bouchon thought it was a project that could work. By 1942, it had been endorsed by the Brethren Service Committee. 1943, Claire Stein is raising Faith, heifer cow number 1. 1944, over 1,000 cows are ready to be shipped. This was an idea that Dan actually came up with before the U.S. was involved in the war. The first, of course, as many here know, the first cattle, Faith and others went to Puerto Rico. Other cattle ended up in places like Arkansas, where they were distributed by a couple of the significant U.S. One was government agencies, including the Southern Farmers Tenant Union, one of the more interesting and radical organizations, interracial social justice organization in Arkansas. Basically, heifer, there are, when often people talk about heifer, they talk about 3 people. The guy who came up with the idea, Dan West, and I actually was really surprised at how little heifer-related correspondence and materials there are in the Dan West papers. He's the idea guy. M.R. Ziegler, another Church of the Brethren leader of that time, raised consciousness. Basically, Ziegler had tons of Brethren, Mennonite, and ecumenical commitments, and he spread the good news of heifer. By 1946, heifer was already an ecumenical project with Lutheran, Catholic, Methodist, especially Mennonite, and evangelical and Reformed cooperation. By 1947, one of the great M.R. Ziegler stories, he managed to donate a bull to the Vatican. Pope Pius XII announced that this was a most interesting papal bull. By 1951, there were 11,000 heifers, bulls, goats, horses, had been sent to over 20 countries. By 1953, heifer was incorporated as a nonprofit agency separated from the Church of the Brethren. By 1994, heifer had already worked in 110 countries and 35 states. Having repeatedly failed to Manchester University, having repeatedly failed to give Dan West an honorary degree because he wouldn't take one, in 1995, Heifer received an honorary degree from Manchester University, although it probably should have gone to Faith. If imitation is the highest form of flattery, everyone imitates at least part of the Heifer project. At Christmas time, I have seen Episcopal, Lutheran, World Vision, even smaller denominations like Free Methodists actually are giving people an opportunity to buy animals, chickens, and stuff and send them around the world. But of course, these agencies are imitating Heifer's fundraising tactics, not its mission. In the beginning, Dan West was very concerned about one thing, which should concern everyone who does humanitarian work, and that is paternalism. How do we stop from micromanaging the gifts that we give? Do we actually give them openly? Part of the genius, his answer was passing on the gift. That is, the first heifer was donated to someone else. But Heifer went beyond that. It's not only the animals, but it's the training that goes with it. The goal is to make participants, the recipients, into participants in the program. And that's been part of the Heifer genius, and that's part of the Dan West legacy. Secondly, human relationships are valued. All of the Brethren programs of the post-World War II era, one of the things that really impresses anyone who looks at them is the fact that the goal is not merely to do something or help somebody, it's to establish relationships. And it's things like Christian youth student exchange, bringing people over, sending your children over to Europe, or my favorite Brethren exchange program probably is farmer exchanges, in which Brethren farmers went to Poland and farmers from Poland and Russia came to the United States. Again, the goal is to build relationships. The goal is to make it harder to kill somebody, actually. Because if you have a relationship, you're less likely to shoot them. Well, there may be exceptions to that, but also, Heifer recipients were asked to write letters, if they were able, to the Americans who sent the things. And that was also part of it. It was not merely to make Americans feel that their animals were getting to where they said they were going. It was to establish relationships and to build community across boundaries. And for the Church of the Brethren programs, it was often done with groups of people who were considered adversaries. And that's part of the key thing. As Dan West said, you help everyone. A cow doesn't know the difference between a communist and a capitalist child. Now, if one's notion of ending war through gifts of livestock seems naive, part of the reason I wrote Who's Your Prophet? And I basically wrote it, although Jay Whitmire and I were hoping it would be useful to Heifer. But I really wrote it, to be honest, for the Church of the Brethren. Partially because it was clear from reading Dan's writings that he was passionate about the future of the church. It was to help a hopelessly divided body understand the period in its history and understand its key actors and a remarkable humanitarian vision. To be honest, I'm a product of another time and another war. For most of us who grew up in the 1960s and after, it's hard to trust, it's a lot harder to trust the government. It's a lot harder to cooperate with USAID. It's the fear that the CIA may be using your humanitarian work to accomplish its less than humanitarian mission. My real political models, many of them, are the so-called isolationists of the 1930s, like Robert La Follette Jr., who, while deeply committed to humanitarian efforts across the globe, believed that another war would create an American empire that there would be no coming back from. That empire would have its own goals, its own dreams. I, like many others in the 1960s and 1970s, were attracted not to the ecumenical vision of the Church of the Brethren, but its sectarian heritage. I had a great conversation a few years ago with David Hollinger, who I really, really like, as wrong as he is. And he, the son of a Church of the Brethren minister, professor of history at Berkeley, asked me, why did the Church of the Brethren abandon its ecumenical vision of the 1960s? Why didn't it become part of a great Protestant denomination as it should have? Well, and I said, well, you know, probably people like me. Because the truth of the matter is that ecumenical vision is part of a different time and a different place. Dan West was moderator of the 1966 annual conference that actually affirmed the church's sectarian heritage. And Dan, I think, was pretty sympathetic to that decision, by the way. I'm part of a generation that was concerned that the church was selling its soul for a bowl of soup. Now, for me, the study of history isn't really an exercise in judging people from the past by our superior and exalted standards. The goal is gaining understanding. With Hoosier Prophet, I sought to gain understanding with a vision that I really don't completely agree with, and I felt I didn't fully understand. I'd like to leave you with 6 cornerstones. A proper Heifer conclusion would have 12 cornerstones, of course. There are things I learned from Dan West and things I think that the world needs to hear. Dan wrote a wonderful essay in the Gospel Messenger after his mother died about her. It begins with, "We live more in deeds than in years." Or again, West, on another occasion, said, "Our words and our deeds fit together, a necessary factor in integrity." Or again, "We live our way into our thinking more than we think our way into our living." Dan had a great knack with words. What we're talking about here is integrity. We judge a tree by its fruit. If we want to go to a higher authority, Jesus. Secondly, Dan began his career as an educator, and he never stopped teaching. In a 1928 letter he wrote to his friend Joe Van Dyke, one of the early great youth workers in the Church of the Brethren, and Dan started out as a Church of the Brethren youth worker and basically was doing youth work when he died in 1971, as all true youth workers are. "I believe in goodness, friendship, sacrifice. I believe in the power of the universe. The power of the universe is not aimless, self-destructive. Life is good, and it promises even greater good. I don't need to say that I believe this. I know it." Historians have a word for this kind of thinking. These people are progressives. It's much like his father's vision, though. A bright day is coming. And the reality is, if we don't believe a bright day is coming, we probably are going to do a lot less good in the world. It's Jürgen Moltmann's theology of hope. Maybe learned it from John Barwick. Thirdly, Dan West loved lists. And Hoosier Prophet has several of these lists that Dan came up. And one of my favorite is a Brethren Flower Catalog, which lists qualities. One of them simply says, we follow the commandments of Jesus without being literalists. What he says is to be done. Here is an example. We forgive 70 times 7. Pretty hard words. Fourthly, one of the things that really impresses, and one of the things I wanted to really impress me about Dan West was his anti-materialism. This is not Madonna's Material Girl. Although I think Madonna does understand lots about our society, by the way. In 1966, he wrote an essay published in the Messenger. Let's start a war on affluence. Of course, this is during JFK's or Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. In it, he quotes John Kenneth Galbraith. The other thing Dan West loved to do is he collected quotations. Wealth is the relentless enemy of understanding. Up to a point, West observed, more things mean more life. Beyond it, more things mean less life, even though they always seem to promise more life. Or in the words of Jesus, a person's life is not made secure by what they own, even when they have more than they need. Materialism still stalks our land. Fifthly, as a way of curbing personal ambition, teach the meaning of we, ours, as more than I, me, mine. We live in a world where we tend to be navel gazers. We tend to look at ourselves. Dan West reminds us that plural pronouns need to be cultivated. There is appropriate self-care, but not at the expense of others. Finally, Dan West wrote, the world will come to see that Jesus' way is the only practical way of life, but it must be demonstrated first. If brethren count the cost, then decide to pay more than their share, the world will be redeemed sooner, maybe soon enough to prevent another world war. Vintage Dan West. The promise of peace in the midst of a world that looked like it was headed for destruction and may still be. In 1966, Dan wrote a poem that I really like. In fact, I like it so much it appears 3 times in Hoosier Prophets. I think Brethren Press made me take it out. It was actually 4 times, I think. It's called Witch Cross. Dear Lord, my cross is heavy, the weight of it, with other things, is bending down my head. My knees are weak, my back and arms are sore. Do I have to carry it anymore? Couldn't I just worship yours instead? This is a critique of the Christianity that we're all too familiar with. The Christianity without the cross, a Christianity that promises forgiveness without the hope of the side of death of an actual Christian life. Like his father's bright day coming, it's optimistic. It urges action, not contemplation. Now, I have to admit it resonates with me because I like Dan West tend to reduce Christianity to ethics. One of my Bethany professors, Estelle Horning, told us one morning that the problem with visionary leaders like Dan West was they had forgotten, that we're sinners and we need forgiveness. And I actually, and Anna Mao actually shared that critique. Although Anna Mao, the great Brethren devotional writer, did love Dan West because he caused so much trouble for the church bureaucracy. And I understand that critique, and I think it's valid. There is an element in the Church of the Brethren heritage, occasionally brethren should probably read a little Luther. And the highlight of my career as director of the Brethren Historical Library and Archives was an opportunity to interview Don Murray, who died in January of this year. Some of you may not know who Don Murray is. But his claim to fame is that he starred with Marilyn Monroe in Bus Stop. And was a constant source of, when people wanted to hear Marilyn Monroe stories, they would call him up. And he had a ready, he would tell you that she came to her senses and got rid of Arthur Miller because he was weak on unions and stuff like this. But anyway, Don was a conscientious objector, raised in a United Church of Christ family, who had trouble with his draft board, trouble believing that an actor could actually be serious about anything. But the Brethren service was willing to take him on. He caused an early crisis because he wanted to be baptized. And Dan West and other Brethren leaders did not see BVS as a proselytizing agency. If they had, we might have more members now. But anyway, that's part of the Don Murray story. But he looked at me and he said, Brethren service changed my life. I had never gone to college, but orientation was basically college to me. He went to Italy and Sardinia and established a program called HELP for refugees from Eastern Europe. A program that got lots of attention. I interviewed him for a different reason, though. The great story that Brethren Voluntary Service is responsible for the Peace Corps. And so I got the Don Murray version of the story, which mostly consisted of, it was an idea that JFK stole from Hubert Humphrey, and Hubert Humphrey really deserved the credit. But it was an incredible experience. Don died in January of this year. And of course, there were a few obituaries that mentioned that he was a conscientious objector, a few obituaries that mentioned something about Brethren service, lots of mentions about Marilyn Monroe, lots of mention that I did learn from one of the obituaries, so a shocking fact, that he played a pivotal role in the film that's the foundation for Christian History magazine, which excited me to no end. I'm sure no one else was excited by that fact. But it was, what I'm trying to say is this is part of a heritage that changed lives and changed people. The seagoing cowboys who went with the cattle. I did wonder when reading the story about shipping bulls overseas, and Ken may be able to help me with this. You have to be awful brave to ship a bull overseas. I said I loved cows, but bulls are another story. they're downright dangerous and not nearly as friendly. But the end and the point I wanted to make is the heritage of Heifer is the heritage of actually meeting and serving the needs, not of large bodies of people, but of individual families in very different parts of the world. Heifer may not have ended war. It may not end hunger by 2030, but it tried. And we are here, and we here are products of that vision. And it's a vision that each one of us can celebrate.
Thank you, Bill. I'd now like to invite Sarita Sandesham, who is the CEO of Heifer International, has filled that role since 2022, born and raised in Singapore and educated in the United Kingdom, the University of London, as an attorney. She has more than 2 decades of leadership in global nonprofit organizations, working on behalf of vulnerable populations. And we welcome her to share a bit about Heifer International's current work and its mission to end hunger and poverty while caring for the earth by providing appropriate livestock training and related services to small-scale farmers and communities worldwide. Welcome, Sarita.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Excellent. So can you bear with me for another 10 minutes as I bring us along into the 21st century? I want to thank Bill for that excellent grounding of the history of Heifer. And I also want to thank Steve for inviting me and Nate Hostler for inviting me here today. This is my first time in Elizabethtown. And I want to also let you know that, one of the things about coming from Singapore, which is in Southeast Asia, and I'm no farmer, and ending up running Heifer International has been an amazing trajectory. And what I would just say is that all of the work that I have done up to date has been preparing me for supporting this organization into the 21st century. I worked in human rights, I've worked with refugees and displaced people, and I've worked on thinking about how you build partnerships across sectors, which would include government, private sector, and communities to solve very difficult problems. And the biggest problem, and yes, you're right, we are not going to end hunger and poverty and improve the land by 2030. That's not going to happen. However, we are going to work in partnership with communities who we have a deep relationship with. And this is the legacy of Dan West and the Church of the Brethren. In the year and a half I've been here, I've been learning about our history. And I want to honor that history. And I also want you to know that the very values, the cornerstones, the passing on the gift, continue to this day. And given the way that the world is today, we're completely disconnected. We don't trust each other. I mean, peace building is, in the back seat, given what's going on in the world. You've got climate change, you've got deprivations, you've got high prices of food, inputs. All of that, it impacts the most vulnerable of communities that we support. So I want to say that we are an international development organization. We work in 19 countries. And one of the things that we are focused on is really about partnering and supporting communities in rural areas to build resilience so that they can work through and get to a good place with their families and get to a sustainable living income. And you can imagine in this time, it's really, really difficult. And I wanted to also just mention that in the 19 countries that we work in, we're in 3 regions. We're in Africa, we're in Asia, we're in Latin America, and we're also in the US. Bill mentioned Arkansas. I moved from Chicago to take this job in Little Rock, Arkansas, and we have this 1,200-acre ranch in Perryville, and it is a model for regenerative agriculture. And we are also working with farmers in Mississippi to raise pasture hog farms. And we're thinking about how to get them to market. But in the countries outside of the US, we are working with these different communities, and we invest in agricultural value chains. So, Bill said it's the cows. Well, it's the cows plus. Farmers don't make all of their money from their farms. They have to do other things. So it's thinking about crops. It's thinking about different value chains. And there are about 14 value chains depending on which region that you're talking about. And what we're trying to do is build social capital and capacity at the community level, at the regional and national levels, to help farmers basically build viable livelihoods, increase their incomes, and better integrate women, youth, and indigenous populations in market systems that are inclusive of them. And it builds, therefore, stronger, more resilient communities. And one of the ways that we've been doing this has been around incorporating the 12 cornerstones, the very values that come out of the Church of the Brethren with community. And the way that we do that is, or the reason we do that is it creates a sense of community. It creates a safety net to allow people to rely on each other. We rely on each other, and we almost take it for granted, right? Based on the community that we're part of. We do that with communities in these different countries. And when I went to visit them in Nepal and Ecuador, I was blown away by how proud they were of being part of something like Heifer International. Not in that way that is considered paternalistic, but in the way that says we feel that we're a part of a larger movement that's going to make a difference. And one of the things that I realized is that our staff don't feel that way. It's happening with community, but they themselves don't feel that way. And so one of the things that we're trying to do now is to make sure that the Cornerstones training happens with our staff and also with our board, so that we feel that deep connection to addressing hunger, poverty, and caring for the earth. And we take a holistic approach. We don't see these things as, just livestock. You need to think about the fodder that you're feeding the livestock that's going to help climate. You also need to think about, is there a market for any of these value chains? We don't go in and say, right, let's just do goats. But then there's no market to sell the goats. And one of the things I want to say that we really do well is we take a long view to the problem. We don't go in and we don't do what USAID does. I will say, though, I would take advantage of USAID to start the project and then build that project out for a longer period. So there's a strategic partnership that you can build with organizations doing similar work. The other piece that I want to say that we also work on is, given that we are working on agricultural value chains, we also recognize, particularly with women and youth, that the norms are not there to support them. I mean, gender norms are pretty horrible in some of the places that we work in India and Nepal. So, and these are women who are business women who are working on agriculture. So we want to make sure, right, that we're thinking not just about the agricultural input, we're also thinking about the society in which they're working in. And that requires us to work in partnership with other organizations who are also in the same space. And that way you have an ability to have a ripple effect. I believe, and I'm so proud to have this role, is that Heifer is an organization that, because of its reputation, we've impacted 46 million people. And we have this goal of adding 10 million additional families to get to a sustainable living income. When I walked in the door, I was told there's no way we can reach our goal by 2030. And it's true, we aren't going to reach that goal. However, we were only thinking about it in relationship to what we were doing, not to what we could be doing with others. And so we're going through a process of reviewing our program strategy, and we're looking to build partnerships. I guess one of the things I want to say about right now is just maybe talk a little bit about what we do in the particular regions. Really being clear about where the space is to create leverage and actually address hunger and poverty. So in Africa, many of you may know this, it has a very young population. And we anticipate that by 2050, one in every 4 people will be an African. And how do you take that youth bulge and create a dividend out of that? And the way that we've been doing it is actually been promoting young people by giving them grants, small catalytic funds, so that they can innovate in agriculture. They come from agricultural families. Their families don't really want them to work in agriculture. It's not sexy. But if you can think about how you use technology and how you can create maybe organic ways of growing crops, really thinking about how you work with youth and their ingenuity, that's the way that we're going to make the shift in agriculture. And so we've been doing that in Africa, in the 11 countries that we're in. It's called the Ayute program. And it's amazing what small sums of money can go in terms of sort of developing the ingenuity, and then having these young people who are part of the sort of community, right, that is Heifer, then go out to larger funders like the World Food Program, who are doing similar work and who are thinking, wow, this is great, let's fund them. And so we look at those ways, which is very different from, say, giving a cow. And I am going to talk about cows in a moment. It's going to be my last story. And in Asia, where we are in 4 countries, Nepal, India, Cambodia, and Bangladesh, we have the experience of supporting farming communities as they form self-help groups, essentially groups to support themselves through savings and cooperatives. And when I went there last year, I got to meet with these amazing women who talked to me about the 12 cornerstones. And they're leading these 400,000 families in an apex body. And what they want to do in Nepal, because they're not bankable as women, because you can't get loans from banks because they have no collateral, or they have the regular ways that banks give you loans. They want to create their own bank. And there's a way that we can support them and to think about ways of how they can create their own bank so that they can support their own communities. And that's coming from them. In the Americas, the women and indigenous populations we work alongside with are around value chains like dairy, spices, and shellfish. And in Guatemala, and I just went there very recently, we have a program called the Green Business Belt Program, and it supports sustainable production techniques for cardamom and other spices. These are all done by indigenous women. Cardamom is a huge spice in terms of its productivity, not only for Guatemala, but also for export. But these indigenous women have never had any, entree into the trade. And so we're working with them to create that entree, including setting up a social enterprise And one of the greatest things about the social enterprise, which we've just set up with, with us providing some of the financial backing, is to actually make sure that the women own the co-op, that this social enterprise. So they actually own 49% of this enterprise, which is brand new. I'm very proud of. And what we want to do is not just step away, but, in partnership, make sure that we get to a point where it shows profitability. And that's not there yet. So the cow story. So we heard about cows being sent over, seagoing cowboys, all happening, in the period that Bill just listed out. So the cornerstone of passing on the gift, it builds on essentially this sense of reciprocity and a sustainability and a vision towards the long term. And a real sense, right? It's an asset. So there's been an inspiring example of the ripple effect of this passing on the gift spanning decades, more than 70 years. Now we're in our 80th year, right? And more than 70 years ago, during the Korean War, then the head of Heifer, Saul Metzger, launched a series of animal gifts to then suffering South Korea. South Korea is not suffering anymore, not in that way. And it's gone to become an economic powerhouse, boasts a dairy industry among the most productive in the world. So in December of 2022, I just begun, the South Korean government decided to pass on the gift of 100 purebred Holstein dairy cows and 2 breeding bulls, by the way, to Nepal to help them develop a high-quality dairy sector of their own. Because the quality, the genetics, not so hot in Nepal. And the reason that Korea wanted to do this, it was give back, right? It was a gift. It's like, we got this gift, in the 50s, we're now going to pay it forward. And this passing on the gift is continued to Nepal. And what's interesting is they didn't come by boat. They were shipped in these crates that were made specially from them, and they survived. I mean, it's unbelievable. And we had Korean vets come over, support the Nepali government, and this is done with the Nepali government. What was Heifer? Heifer was a facilitator. Heifer was making sure that the governments were talking to each other, because at the end of the day, right, we want the communities to get this, and the communities do have this. But the government has to make sure that all of the pieces are in place, and we want to support them on that. And so just last month, and as we start our 80th year, the first purebred Holstein calf was born in Nepal, and it's made a significant milestone in this effort. And it's a real example, right, of a passing on the gift chain, sustaining goodwill around the world. I think these are moments, given whatever is going on in the world, we must celebrate, because the communities are getting something out of this, and it's sustainable beyond Heifer, but we play a role, and that's the kind of role that we want to play. We want to be a partner with our communities. We want to listen very carefully, and we want to continue the values that created Heifer through Dan West. And that I will assure you till today, it is still very much a part of the DNA of this organization. And you should feel very proud of, having created that. And, as Bill said, this is a product of your work as well. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me. Yes, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Sarita. So as we've just heard, this is not 80 years of history. This is very current, very contemporary, very ongoing. And that's where we're going tomorrow morning with the DURNBAUGH seminar. The world in which Heifers for Relief took shape 80 years ago was markedly different from the world today, and yet human need in many ways remains the same. So tomorrow morning at 9:30, not in this room, but at the Young Center across campus, Booker Meeting House, at 9:30, we will reconvene for a conversation about the changing and current landscape of relief, development, and service. What are the issues of dependence and interdependence, strategies for nurturing an ethic of service, localism and globalism, and so on. Our discussants include Sarita Sandesham, from whom we just heard, Nate Hostler, Director of the Church of the Brethren's Office of Peace Building and Policy, Reverend Lexi Aligarbas, co-pastor of Harrisburg First Church of the Brethren, Dr. Sanjay Paul, Associate Professor of Economics here at Elizabethtown College, and Alan Epp Weaver, Director of Strategy at Mennonite Central Committee. And those folks will be discussing these very contemporary and current issues, what's happening now, where do we go from here? And the other very important part of that discussion will be all of you and whoever else arrives tomorrow morning. So we will have two structured conversations, one at 9:30, and we'll have a break, another one at 11. So please come back and join us at the Young Center for that conversation of what is the current and future of Heifer and of all of these efforts of humanitarian relief and development and service, domestically and internationally. Look forward to seeing many of you there tomorrow. And thank you all very much for coming this evening. Thank you for your support of the Young Center, and safe travels as you return home this evening. Good night.